The storm had no name. It didn't need one. It came down from the northern ridgeline sometime before dawn and buried everything: the supply road, the radio tower, the 3 vehicles that had made it this far before their engines quit. By the time the forward aid station logged it as a Category 4 weather event, the wind was already tearing at the tent seams with a sound like a scalpel on canvas. She stood outside in it, not moving, not shivering, just standing there in the white, wearing a field jacket 2 sizes too large, and boots that didn't match left foot, standard army issue, right foot, something older, something that had been resold at least twice. No pack, no visible weapon, no insignia. Corporal Dean Harlow saw her first through the frost-cracked window of the intake tent. He watched her for nearly 40 seconds before he said anything. "There's a woman standing in the storm," he announced. Nobody looked up. Outside, just standing there. Sergeant Pauline Vickers finally raised her head from the triage manifest. She looked through the window. She looked at Harlow. She looked back through the window. "Well," she said, "go ask her what she wants." He didn't want to go outside, but he went. The cold hit him like a wall. He crossed the 12 feet of packed snow between the tent and the woman in the time it took him to stop breathing through his nose. And when he got close enough to see her face, the first thing he noticed was her eyes. They were not frightened. They were not asking for anything. They were doing something else entirely, moving, slowly, methodically, from the ridgeline to the tree line to the angle of the snow where it had drifted against the supply crates. Reading something, measuring something he couldn't see. "Hey," he said, "you need help?" She looked at him. She didn't answer. "You lost? Where'd you come from?" "Nothing." He noticed her hands. They were bare, in -20 wind chill, and they weren't shaking. He brought her inside. That was how it started, with a woman who wouldn't speak, in a storm that wouldn't stop, in a forward aid station that had already seen too much and was about to see more. They didn't know her name. They didn't know her unit. They didn't know why she was there or where she'd been or what had left those faint, long-healed scars along the left side of her jaw. They didn't know what she had survived to arrive at this particular station in this particular storm, or what she had left behind to get here, or whether what she had left behind was a place, or a decision, or something less tangible than either. They didn't know about the patch. Not yet. The forward aid station had been running for 11 days without resupply. It occupied what used to be a timber company's field office, 1 large central room, 2 smaller rooms off the back, a generator room that flooded every time the snow melted and refroze. The roof held. The heating system did not entirely. And so the central room ran on 2 propane heaters and collective body heat, and the particular stubbornness of people who had decided, some time ago, that complaining about the cold was a luxury they couldn't afford. 12 personnel, 8 patients, 2 critical. Dr. Raymond Marsh ran the station. He was 53, gray-bearded, with hands that no longer shook even when the rest of him did. He had been in field medicine for 22 years and had the specific, unhurried demeanor of someone who had learned that panic was its own kind of wound. He processed the woman the way he processed everything, without ceremony. "She come in on her own?" he asked Harlow. She was standing outside. "For how long?" "Don't know. Could have been, I don't know." Marsh looked at the woman. She was sitting on a supply crate near the far wall, not leaning against it, just sitting with her back straight and her hands resting on her knees. She had accepted the blanket someone draped over her shoulders but hadn't pulled it tighter. She was watching the room. Not the people specifically. The room, the angles of it, the placement of the 2 exits, the way the propane heater on the left was positioned closer to the medical supply shelves than was probably safe. "What's your name?" Marsh asked her. "Nothing." "Are you injured?" Her eyes moved to him. She shook her head once. "Can you speak?" A pause. Then, very deliberately, she tilted her head slightly, not quite yes, not quite no, something more complicated than either. Harlow snorted behind him. "Great. A mute." "She's not mute," Marsh said, without turning around. He didn't know why he said it. He just knew it was true. There was a difference between someone who couldn't speak and someone who had decided, for reasons of their own, not to. He had met both. This was the second kind. He checked her vitals. She allowed this without fuss, extending her arm for the cuff. turning her face when he needed to check her eyes, temperature slightly low but not dangerously so. Pulse steady and slower than it should have been for someone who had just walked through a blizzard. Pupils responsive. Tracking. "She can stay," he told Harlow. "Sir, we don't have the space." "She can stay." He went back to his patients. The woman remained on the crate. After a while, without being asked, she picked up a mop that was leaning against the wall someone had tracked in blood earlier, half cleaned, and finished the job. She worked methodically, wringing the mop with more efficiency than most people managed, moving equipment to get at the corners. Harlow watched her do this with an expression that had started somewhere near contempt and had not moved very far. "At least she's useful for something," he said, to Private Garrett Sims, who was young enough to still think that cruelty needed an audience. Sims laughed. The woman did not react. Her face remained composed, distant. She finished mopping and set the mop back against the wall in the same position she had found it, and then she returned to her crate and sat back down with her hands on her knees. Her eyes resumed their slow, patient circuit of the room. Outside, the storm continued. The radio crackled with interference. Someone in the back room coughed wetly and long. It was 17 minutes past noon when they brought in the first man with a bullet wound. His name was Specialist Marcus Webb, age 24, shot through the upper right thorax, entry wound clean, exit wound not clean. He'd been found by a two-man patrol half a kilometer from the eastern perimeter, packed in snow that had slowed the bleeding but done nothing for the shock. He came in on a stretcher that two exhausted privates had carried through knee-deep drifts for 20 minutes. The room shifted. This was what the aid station did, it shifted. Not dramatically, not with shouting. People simply moved differently, spoke differently. The air changed pressure. Marsh was already at the table before the stretcher reached it, already speaking in the low, rapid shorthand that Corporal Yolanda Fisk, his best medic, had learned to follow without being told twice. The woman on the crate stood up. She didn't come forward. She didn't approach the table. She stayed by the wall and she watched, but she watched the wound, not the procedure. Her head tilted fractionally to the right, then back. Her eyes dropped to Webb's right side, to the angle of entry, to the spread of the bruising visible above his collar. Then, she looked at the wall, the exterior wall, the one facing east. Then at the ceiling. Marsh noticed her doing this. He filed it away and kept working. "What's the trajectory?" Fisk asked, swabbing. "Through and through, high chest. Missed the lung, I think. Maybe not." He pressed his fingers carefully along the rib line. "Going to need the portable scanner. Generators." "I know. Work with what we have." The procedure took 40 minutes. Webb was stable at the end of it, or stable enough which in a forward aid station meant alive and not immediately dying. Marsh stripped off his gloves and found a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago and drank it anyway. He looked across the room. The woman was crouched by the east wall. Not against it, crouching near it, one hand resting against the wood paneling, palm flat, like she was checking for vibration, or temperature differential, or something else that Marsh couldn't name. "Hey!" Harlow moved toward her. "What are you doing?" She looked up at him. She spread her free hand, the one not touching the wall, and made a slow, deliberate gesture, a flat palm moving at a slight downward angle, then her fingers spreading to indicate something. Dispersal, or arc, or trajectory. Harlow looked at her hand, then at Marsh. "She's doing it again," Sim said. He was leaning against a cabinet, arms folded. "The weird thing. She's been doing it since Webb came in," Fisk said quietly. She was watching the woman with a different expression than the others, not warm, exactly, but attentive, careful. "What's she trying to say?" Marsh asked. The woman looked at him. She stood, crossed to the supply table, found a piece of paper and a pen. She drew a horizontal line, then a point above and to the left of the line, then a small angle, maybe 30 degrees, connecting the point to the line. She tapped the point. She looked at Marsh. "That's where the shot came from?" he asked. She nodded once. "That's the." Marsh turned, oriented himself. "That's northwest, the ridge line." She tapped the paper again, harder. "The northeast ridge line," Fisk said, looking at the angle. "If you account for the wind drift." Harlow made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She's guessing. She didn't even see the man come in until 5 minutes before we did." "She's been watching the wind since this morning," Marsh said, mostly to himself. "Sir, with respect, she can't speak. She has no ID. We don't know where she came from. Why are we taking shooting trajectories from her?" The woman looked at Harlow. Her expression did not change. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, dismissing him with a patience that was somehow more cutting than any response she could have spoken. Harlow's jaw tightened. "Take her paper," Marsh told Fisk. "Log the angle. We'll see." Harlow didn't say anything else, but before he turned back to his station, he leaned down and swept the paper off the table, not handing it to Fisk, just moving it aside, letting it drift to the floor. The woman watched the paper fall. She didn't pick it up. She went back to her crate and sat down. But her eyes, when she closed them briefly and then opened them again, had changed. Something small and old and very controlled had moved across them, and then it was gone. By nightfall, they had 2 more wounded. The second came in at 1600 hours, a corpsman named Ellis who'd been doing a routine equipment check at the vehicle depot and had taken a round through the left shoulder, a clean shot that would have been manageable if he hadn't fallen on the ice and fractured his collarbone in the fall. He arrived angry and white-faced and told them he hadn't heard the shot. Just the impact, just the sudden missing of his shoulder, and then the ice. The third came in at 1847. A civilian contractor, a heavyset man named Boyd Callahan, who had been doing something with the fuel lines and now had a wound in his upper left thigh that the shooter had clearly intended for somewhere higher. He was the one who told them he'd seen a muzzle flash. His hands wouldn't stay still, not from the pain, Marsh thought, but from the realization that a person somewhere in all that white had made a considered decision about where to put a round in him. "Where?" Marsh asked. Callahan pointed. He was slightly delirious from blood loss and not entirely reliable, but the direction he pointed was northeast. Marsh turned and found the woman watching him from across the room. She didn't say "I told you." She didn't gesture at the paper she'd drawn on, which was still on the floor where Harlow had let it fall. She just watched him with that patient, unflinching attention, and waited. "Fisk," Marsh said. "Get the paper." Fisk retrieved it. She smoothed it against the table. The crease where it had fallen and lain was across the middle of the angle sketch, but the drawing was still readable. A simple geometry, nothing complicated, the kind of thing a person draws when they are not trying to explain their reasoning but simply to record a conclusion they reached some other way, through a process that doesn't translate to paper. The angle on the paper matched the direction Callahan had pointed within perhaps 10 degrees. Given his condition, given the visibility, given everything, that was a match. Marsh looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he looked at the woman. "Come here," he said. She came. She moved across the room without hurry, without any performance of purpose, just crossed the distance and stopped at the table and waited. He spread a topographic map on the table. It was 3 months old and had coffee stains on the eastern quadrant and a small tear along the western fold where someone had handled it too many times in cold hands. It was what they had. He set the paper with her angle sketch beside it and aligned the orientations. "Show me," he said. She studied the map. She picked up the pen. Her movement was unhurried, deliberate, the movement of someone who had looked at maps like this for a long time, in a lot of different conditions, and had learned to read them the way other people read faces. She oriented herself. She measured something against the scale legend with her thumb and forefinger. Then she put the pen point on the map. Then she drew a line from that point, moving northeast along the ridgeline toward the station's position. Then she moved the pen to a second point. A third. She looked up at Marsh and held up 3 fingers. He stared at her. 3 shots? 3 different positions? She shook her head. She moved her hand. 1 shooter. But she tapped the 3 positions she'd marked. 3 positions. 1 shooter. Moving. She nodded. The room had gone quiet. Not the quiet of people ignoring something, but the quiet of people paying attention without wanting to admit they were paying attention. Harlow had drifted toward the table from across the room, moving sideways, the way people do when they want to see something but haven't decided yet to acknowledge wanting to see it. "How far?" Marsh asked. She considered. She picked up the pen and wrote a number below the last position mark. 1,400 meters. Harlow, who had walked over despite himself, made a sound. "That's not possible," he said. "In this visibility?" In this wind? The woman looked at the number she had written. She did not look at Harlow. Her face held the particular stillness of someone who has been told something is impossible by a person who has never tried it, and who has decided that arguing about the definition of possible is not a productive use of time. She drew a small box around the number, precise, unhurried, like she was settling an argument she had no interest in having. "Whoever this is," Fisk said quietly, "they know what they're doing." "Or she's just guessing again," Sims said. But his voice had changed. He said it because he was supposed to say it, because he had been saying it, not because he still believed it. 3 patients, Marsh said. 3 shots, none of them fatal. He paused. He was looking at the map, at the line she had drawn, at the careful triangulation of it. Why not fatal? Nobody answered. The woman picked up the pen again. She wrote 2 words below the distance estimate, pressed hard enough that the pen indented the paper. "Warning shots." The generator hiccuped. The lights dimmed and came back. Outside, the storm doubled down. The old doctor had a habit of watching what other people didn't. Marsh had been watching her for 2 days, the way she positioned herself, always with a sightline to both doors, the way she tracked sounds. When the wind shifted, her head moved first, before the sound fully registered, as if she was anticipating it. The way she had assessed Ellis's wound before any of the medics had, her eyes finding the entry angle, the impact spread, the bruise pattern, with the speed of someone performing a calculation they had performed 10,000 times. On the second morning, he brought her coffee. She accepted it. She wrapped both hands around the cup, not for warmth, he thought, but for something to do with her hands. He sat across from her. He didn't ask questions. He had learned, a long time ago, that silence was either the enemy of communication or its highest form, depending on who you were sitting with. After about 4 minutes, she reached into the inner pocket of her jacket. She removed something and set it on the table between them. A small notebook. The kind with the stiff cover and the elastic band. Military issue but personal. There were scuff marks on the corners, a dark stain on the back that he didn't look at too long. She opened it to a page near the middle. Hand-drawn diagrams. Clean, precise. Wind charts, trajectory calculations, distances annotated in a tiny, controlled handwriting. The last entry was from 2 days ago. The positions matched what she had drawn on the paper. All 3 positions, with distances, with estimated wind correction. Marsh sat with this for a moment. "You've been tracking this shooter since before you got here," he said. She closed the notebook. She nodded. "How long?" She held up 4 fingers. 4 days. She nodded. He thought about that. "You followed them here? Or you followed where they were going?" She considered this distinction. She tapped the table twice. "The second option, you knew they were moving toward us." A nod. "That's why you came." The expression that crossed her face was not quite agreement. It was something more complicated, not affirmation but a kind of grim acknowledgement that the thing she'd feared had happened the way she expected it to happen, and here they were. "Can I ask you something?" Marsh said. She waited. "What's your name?" A long pause. She looked at the coffee cup. Then she reached over and wrote it in the margin of a medical form he had left on the table. 2 letters only. C. V. Initials, he said. She nodded. "That's what I get?" Almost the corner of her mouth moved. He took it. That afternoon, the 4th shot came. A near miss, it took out the corner of the supply shed, a clean hole through the plank siding, and buried itself in a sack of grain stored for the horses. Marsh had the round recovered. He brought it to the table where C.V. was sitting. She picked it up. She turned it over, studied the deformation, the way the jacket had partially separated. She held it up to the light from the window, tilting it slightly. Then she set it down and wrote on the medical form margin again, 338 Lapua Magnum, suppressed, not military issue. Marsh looked at what she'd written. Fisk appeared at his shoulder, reading the words. She went very still. "That's a civilian precision rifle round," Fisk said. V wrote one more word. Mercenary. The panic arrived quietly, the way panic often does in cold places, not as a scream but as a spreading silence, a progressive slowing of movement as people began to understand what they were inside. The aid station was a target, not a casualty of proximity. Not an accident. A target. Marsh called everyone together in the central room. He stood at the table with the topographic map, and the recovered round and the small piece of medical form paper with CV's handwriting on it. And he told them what they knew, which was not much, and what they could reasonably infer, which was more. We have a single shooter operating from a series of elevated positions along the northeast ridgeline. The shots so far have been non-lethal warning shots or demonstration shots. Whoever this is, they're good enough to kill at this distance, and they haven't. That means they're choosing not to. For now, Sims said. For now, Marsh confirmed. Which means something changes between now and the next shot. The room was quiet. What do we have? Harlow asked. He was a different version of himself than 2 days ago, not exactly humbled, but recalibrated. Fear has a way of doing that. 1 bolt-action rifle in the equipment locker. 300 meters effective range in this weather. That's not a solution. Marsh paused. He looked at CV, who was standing at the edge of the group. Do you have a weapon? She shook her head. Can you use ours? She looked at the equipment locker. She wrote on the form she had adopted the margin of that one form as a kind of permanent communication surface, folding it and carrying it in her pocket. At this distance, it won't matter. Then what do we do? Fisk asked. V looked at the map. She pointed to the 3 positions she'd marked. Then she moved her finger along the ridgeline east, then south, then to a point lower on the terrain. They're moving to a closer position, Marsh read. She nodded. How long? She held up 2 fingers, then moved them to indicate the next morning's light. Dawn. She nodded. Why dawn? Harlow asked. Then he answered his own question. Better visibility. Wind drops at first light. Marsh watched CV's face when Harlow said this. Something moved in her expression, not quite approval, but a slight lessening of that permanent, careful remoteness. Like she had recalibrated him slightly upward. So we have tonight, Marsh said. V tapped the map at the lower position. Then she pointed to the equipment locker. She wrote, what else is in there? They went through it together. Marsh, Fisk, and V, standing over the contents spread across the table. The bolt action, 300 rounds of standard ammunition, 2 sidearms, a spotting scope, binoculars with laser rangefinder. She picked up the spotting scope. She turned it over in her hands. She picked up the rangefinder. She looked at Marsh. She wrote, these I can use. To do what? Harlow asked from behind them. She wrote without turning around. Find the exact position before they move. In this weather? At night? She looked at the window. At the storm pressing against the glass. At the way the snow moved, the direction of it, the speed of it. She wrote, the wind tells me where they are. Marsh found her outside at 0200 hours. She was lying in the snow on the north side of the building, flat on her stomach, completely still. The spotting scope braced against a supply crate she had dragged out to use as a rest. She had been there long enough that a thin layer of snow had accumulated on her shoulders, turning her the same white as the ground. He crouched beside her. How long have you been out here? She didn't answer. She was looking through the scope, and every few seconds she would shift it a fraction and then go still again. He waited. After about 10 minutes, she made a small sound, the first sound he had heard her make. Not a word, just a faint exhalation, barely audible. She lifted her head from the scope and wrote in the snow with one finger. N47.2 degrees. He looked at the number. He went inside and found the topographic map and found the grid reference. He came back out. That's a rock outcropping, he said. About 800 meters. She was already writing the second part. They moved up. Closer than I thought. That's not good. She wrote, no. He sat in the snow beside her. He told himself it was because she might need something. And it was partly true. You don't have to tell me anything, he said, after a while. But I've been watching you work for 2 days, and I'd like to understand what I'm watching. She was quiet for so long that he thought she wasn't going to respond. Then she reached into her jacket and removed the small notebook. She opened it. She turned it to face him. On the inside front cover, in handwriting different from the precise technical notations inside, looser, older, written at a different time in a different state, were 4 names. He couldn't read them in the dark. He didn't ask. Your team, he said. She closed the notebook. What happened? She held up 4 fingers. Then 1. Then she pointed to herself. 4 went out. 1 came back. She nodded. That was when you stopped talking. She sat up. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the ridgeline, at the place where the darkness had a slightly different quality that might have been rocks or might have been nothing. She wrote in the snow, "I told them it was clear." He let that sit between them for a moment. "You were the sniper," he said. "You were supposed to verify the position was clear, and it wasn't." She looked at her own handwriting in the snow. Then she reached out and erased it with her palm, flat and complete. "That wasn't what stopped you talking," Marsh said. She looked at him. "The talking stopped because you blamed yourself. The not talking is a punishment." Her expression didn't change. But he had been in medicine long enough to know what people look like when they'd been seen accurately. And she looked like that. She picked up the spotting scope. She went back to looking through it. Marsh sat beside her for another hour, saying nothing until the cold drove him back inside. He lay on his cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about what it cost a person to be competent at something that had taken everything from them. He had met people who had walked away from that kind of competence, who had put it down and found something else to be. He had met fewer who had stayed inside it, who had kept the skills and carried the weight of them and gone on. He didn't know which kind she was. He suspected, watching her in the snow at 0200 hours with the storm still coming down, that she didn't know either. The patch fell out at 0900 hours on the 3rd day. It happened the way small things happen without intention, without preparation. Harlow had been reorganizing the supply room, consolidating space for the 3 additional patients they had taken in overnight, and he'd moved the field jacket that C.V. had left folded over the end of a bunk when she'd changed into dry clothes someone had found for her. The jacket shifted, slipped, fell from the bunk to the floor, and from the inner sleeve pocket, the small, rarely used one near the wrist that most people forgot, was there a patch fell out. Harlow looked at it. He picked it up. It was small. Older than the jacket, the edges worn to softness, the thread of the embroidery faded, a dark background. A single crosshair design in the center, and below it, in capital letters so small they required a second look. 1 mile. 1 bullet. Harlow stood with it in his hand. Corporal Yolanda Fisk came into the supply room, saw his face, and stopped. "What is that?" He showed her. She looked at it for a moment, then she left without speaking, and came back with a man named Sergeant First Class Leonard Price, who had been admitted 2 days ago with a spinal injury from a vehicle rollover and was not ambulatory but was very much alert. Price looked at the patch from his stretcher. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "It fell out of her jacket." "The woman who doesn't, where is she?" They found her at the map table, working on an updated set of trajectory calculations, adjusting her position estimates for the wind that had shifted overnight. She had her back to the room. When Price spoke, she went still. "Turn around," he said. She turned. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the expression of a man trying to reconcile something, 2 images that didn't quite overlap. "Vanessa Cross," he said. It was the first time anyone had said her name in that room. C.V. Cross. Vanessa Cross. The initials fell into place like a key into a lock. She said nothing. But she did not deny it. "I heard you were dead," Price said. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of the flatness of it, replaced by something older, less certain. "We all heard that. They listed you. It was 4 years ago. The operation in the..." He stopped. He looked around the room at the people listening. "You were listed," he said more carefully. After the Halverson Ridge incident, the name hit the room differently than he expected. Not because everyone recognized it, most of them didn't, but because of the way Vanessa Cross's face changed. The smallest possible change, just a fractional tightening, a microscopic withdrawal, like a door being pulled closed from the inside. Price held up the patch. "This is a Northern Precision Unit designation," he said to the room, because he was going to explain whether she stopped him or not. "It's not an official unit. It never appeared in any public record. 12 operators over 15 years, best long-range marksman in the theater. And I mean..." He stopped. He looked at her. The record distance for a confirmed shot at the time of the Halverson Ridge incident was listed at 2,300 meters. You want to tell me what the confirmed distance was that you achieved at Halverson before everything went? Sergeant Price, Marsh said quietly. Price stopped. The room was very quiet. Vanessa Cross looked at the patch in Price's hand. Her jaw was level. Her hands, at her sides, were still entirely still, the way they were when she was calculating, when she was looking through the scope, when she had decided exactly what she was going to do and had committed to it fully. She crossed the room. She took the patch from Price's hand. She looked at it for one moment. Then she folded it, precisely, into a square and put it back in her pocket. She went back to the map table. She picked up the pen. The room continued to breathe. Marsh found Price alone at 1,400 hours and stood in the doorway of the back room until Price looked up. "Tell me about Halverson Ridge," Marsh said. Price was quiet for a moment. He adjusted the pillow under his back. The injury made long periods, immobile, painful, and he had learned to manage it with small adjustments. "What I know secondhand," he said. "I wasn't in that theater. Tell me what you know secondhand." Another pause. The Northern Precision Unit was running a protective operation. A forward command element, 6 people, was being held by a non-state force in a compound about 30 kilometers behind the line. The NPU was tasked with suppressive cover for the extraction team. 4 shooters. Cross was the primary long gun. What happened? The extraction team moved on the compound at 0300. The compound had been under surveillance for 72 hours. NPU had confirmed the guard positions, the patrol patterns, the lines of approach. Cross had confirmed the perimeter was clear. He stopped. "It wasn't clear," Marsh said. "There was a secondary guard position that none of the surveillance had picked up. Single position, inside the eastern wall, not on any of the patrol rotations. Could have been a new addition. Could have been there the whole time and invisible from the angles they had. Doesn't matter." The extraction team went in. The secondary guard opened fire, and in the engagement that followed, the NPU. 3 of the 4 NPU shooters were killed by the return fire. Cross, she was the one who made the original clearance call. She was the one who had to watch it happen. She survived. She was listed as Kia in the initial report. There was confusion in the aftermath. By the time anyone corrected the listing, she was... He paused. Gone. She'd gone off record. No contact, no location, nothing. There were rumors she was in the mountains somewhere. Someone thought they'd seen her at a field station in the northern sector, but no one could confirm it. Marsh looked at the far wall, which was also, approximately, in the direction of the map table in the next room. "She blamed herself for the clearance call," he said. "Anyone in her position would have. And she came here to stop the shooter before the shooter reached us. Looks like..." Marsh thought about 4 names on the inside cover of a notebook. About a woman lying in 2 feet of snow at 0200, looking through a spotting scope with the patience of someone who had decided that patience was the only thing she still had the right to. "She's been doing penance," he said. Price didn't say anything for a moment. "Or she's been practicing," he said finally. "There's sometimes a difference, sometimes there isn't." Marsh went back to the central room. Vanessa Cross was still at the map table. She had covered it with a series of overlapping calculations, wind data, elevation profiles, distance estimates drawn and redrawn as she updated her information. She was building a picture of where the shooter would be at dawn. He watched her work for a while without announcing himself. Her hands moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with confidence in the conventional sense. It was the certainty of someone who had learned something at enormous cost and carried it the only way they could, by not wasting what the learning had purchased. Fisk appeared at Marsh's elbow. "She asked me something," Fisk said quietly. "Earlier." She wrote it down. "What?" Fisk looked at the note in her hand. "She asked if we had any rifle oil, and if the bolt action had been cleaned recently." Marsh looked at the back of Vanessa Cross's head, at the stillness of her. "Tell her yes to the oil," he said, "and no to the cleaning." He went to the equipment locker. He took out the bolt-action rifle. He set it on the table beside her without speaking. She looked at it for a long time. She reached out and touched the barrel with 2 fingers, lightly, the way you touch something you have been avoiding. She did not pick it up. Not yet. Dawn came in gray and slow, the way winter dawns do in mountain country, not a sunrise so much as a gradual admission that darkness was no longer sustainable. At 0520, the wind dropped. It didn't stop. It never entirely stopped. But it fell from a sustained 35 knots to something nearer 15, with pauses, brief moments of near stillness, between gusts. This was the window. Cross had predicted it with a notation in her weather margin the night before. 0500 to 0600, windbreak 12 to 18 knots, gusts to 22. She was already outside. She had gone out at 0430 quietly, without waking anyone, or so she'd thought. Marsh was already awake when the door opened, and he had watched through the frost-filmed window as she moved to the position she had selected the night before, the low berm on the north side of the equipment shed, where the snowpack had been compacted by vehicle traffic and would hold her without sinking. She had the rifle. She had chambered it in the supply room, Marsh knew, because he had heard the specific sound of it, the bolt cycling, the decisive click of the round seating, and he had not gone in. Some things you didn't interrupt. She lay in the snow and she waited. Inside, the station was awake, in the way that pre-dawn tension makes people awake, not alert exactly, not functional, just unable to pretend that sleep was possible anymore. Price was sitting up on his stretcher, his back braced against the wall, his face holding the careful neutrality of a man managing pain that he was not going to discuss. Fisk was standing by the north window. Harlow was sitting against the wall with his knees up, not looking at anything in particular, doing something with his hands that might have been prayer. Sims came to stand beside Marsh at the window. "Can she actually do this?" he asked. It was a real question, not a skeptical one. He had left skepticism somewhere around the time the third patient came in. "I don't know," Marsh said. "I know she's done it before. At this range? In this? I don't know," Marsh said again. Through the window, they could see her silhouette. The low form against the snow, barely distinguishable from the terrain, the rifle a dark line extending from her body, absolutely motionless. She had been in that position for over 40 minutes, and she had not shifted, not adjusted, not moved any part of herself that didn't need to move. The cold didn't matter. He could see that much from inside. Whatever internal temperature she ran at, it wasn't the kind that the weather could reach. He thought about the notebook, about the 4 names on the inside cover that he hadn't been able to read in the dark, about the calculations inside it, days of them, meticulous, updated as the wind changed, as the light changed, as the shooter moved and she tracked the moving and adjusted her numbers. 4 days before she arrived here, she had already been working to stop this. She had followed the danger to its destination and put herself between it and the people she had no obligation to protect. Not because anyone had asked her. Not because there was any structure or authority requiring it. Because she had made a clearance call 4 years ago and been wrong, and 3 people had died because of it, and she had been making different calls ever since, slower calls, more careful calls, calls she rechecked and rechecked until she was as certain as the variables allowed. Not to atone. Or not only to atone. Because it was what she knew how to do, and because the knowing had cost too much to put down. At 0541, Marsh saw the shift in her position, infinitesimal, a centimeter of adjustment, the stock pressing fractionally tighter against her shoulder. She had found something. He didn't know what she saw. He couldn't see it. Whatever she had found in the distance, in the rocks at 800 meters across the snowfield, was invisible to him, a shape in the gray light, a thermal signature, a disturbance in the snow pattern, something that only registered if you had spent enough time looking at cold terrain to know what didn't belong in it. But she had found it, and she had measured it, and now she was running through whatever calculation she ran through, wind, distance, elevation, the angle of the light barely beginning to differentiate from the darkness, the temperature differential between the air near the ground and the air at eye level, 100 variables that she had spent 20 years learning to hold in her mind simultaneously and weight correctly. Her breathing slowed. He could see it even from inside, the interval between her exhales lengthening, the time between each visible cloud of breath extending as she came down toward the slow stillness she needed. Not calm exactly. Something beyond calm. A state that had no good name in the common vocabulary because most people never needed to know it was possible. He thought about 4 names in a notebook. He thought about a woman lying in the snow at 0200, watching and calculating and carrying something that had never gotten lighter. He thought about the question she had written in the snow and then erased. I told them it was clear. He thought about what it had cost her to pick up that rifle this morning. The specific internal transaction of it, not a decision made at the table in one clean moment, but a decision that had started when Price said her name and continued through the night while she lay awake on her cot facing the ceiling, and arrived at the equipment locker where she had touched the barrel with 2 fingers before she picked it up. There was a pause between one gust and the next. A half-second of stillness. The shot was not loud. Suppressed weapons rarely are. It was a sharp crack, immediate, clean, followed by nothing, no echo in all that open white space, no reverberation, nothing. Just the sound and then its absence. Silence. Complete and total silence, even from the wind, which held for one disorienting moment as if the world had paused to register what had just happened, as if even the weather understood that something had been decided. Then a gust came, and the station creaked, and someone inside let out a breath that had been held too long. Cross did not move from her position. Marsh watched her. She remained in the snow, the rifle still at her shoulder, her eyes still at the scope, as if she were not certain of what she had done, or as if certainty required more time than the others were giving it. After 4 minutes, she moved. She lowered the rifle. She pushed herself up from the snow and stood. She turned and looked toward the window. Her face was not what Marsh expected. He had expected relief, or the exhaustion that comes after tension releases. There was a little of that, but mostly what he saw was a woman performing a very careful inventory of herself, checking each interior room for damage, making sure nothing had collapsed that she would need later. She came back inside. Nobody spoke. She set the rifle on the table. She removed the remaining rounds from the magazine and set them beside it. She went to the map table. She picked up the pen. She crossed out the position she had marked. 3 hours after the shot, a 4-vehicle convoy broke through the blocked supply road. The engineers had been working on it since before dawn, cutting through 5 days of accumulated snowpack with equipment that should have arrived 4 days ago. When the lead vehicle reached the aid station, the driver climbed out and looked at the station and then at the people standing in front of it, and whatever he read on their faces made him take off his hat. The relief personnel spread through the station methodically. Patients were assessed for transport. Supplies were offloaded. The radio in the lead vehicle was better than anything the station had, and within 2 hours, a transmission had confirmed what Cross had suggested. The shooter was a contracted individual, now neutralized, hired to pressure the station into abandoning its position before a larger operation moved through the area. The shots had been demonstrative. The plan had been to escalate. It had not gone according to plan. Marsh found Cross standing by the outer wall of the supply shed, in the same position she had taken the shot from, though now she was just standing, not prone, not holding anything, just looking out at the snowfield. He stood beside her. "What will you do now?" he asked. She thought about it for a long time. She wrote on the paper she still carried, "I don't know yet." "That might be good," he said. She looked at him. "Not knowing yet," he said. "Some people figure it out. What comes after?" She looked back at the snowfield. The light was different now. Actual daylight. Thin winter daylight, but real, with shadows and depth, and the particular quality that snow has when the storm finally passes. In the distance, at 800 meters, there was a dark shape in the rocks that had not been there yesterday. She looked at it without expression. "Vanessa," Marsh said. It was the first time he had used her name. She turned to look at him. "You told them it was clear," he said. "And you were wrong. And 3 people died because of it." Her face did not change. "You were also right. Every shot calculation in that notebook, right across 4 days of tracking, right about the position, right about the distance, right about what this morning required." He paused. "Those are both true." At the same time, she looked at the paper in her hand. "You don't have to be done," he said, "with any of it. The work, the silence, the—" He stopped. He wasn't sure he had the language for the rest of it. You can be both things. The thing that failed and the thing that showed up anyway. She looked at him for a long time. There was something moving in her face, slowly. The way ice moves in spring, not melting exactly, just shifting, finding new arrangements. She put the paper in her pocket. She walked back toward the station entrance. The relief personnel were loading the last of the critical patients. Fisk was supervising, managing the logistics of it with her characteristic precision clipboard in hand, checking names against the transport manifest, speaking in the low, clear voice she used when she needed people to move correctly and without confusion. Harlow was helping lift a stretcher, his face showing the particular concentration of someone trying to be useful in a situation he hadn't known how to be useful in until recently. He had stopped making sounds that passed for jokes. He had stopped filling silences with noise. He moved the stretcher carefully, with attention, and when the patient winced, he adjusted his grip without being told. A child appeared from behind the lead vehicle. This was unexpected. The convoy personnel had brought the child for reasons that were briefly explained and not particularly clear. The child's parent was one of the medics. The schools were still closed, logistics of childcare in a crisis area being what they were. The child was a girl, perhaps 7 or 8, red-haired, wearing a coat that was slightly too large and boots that left deep prints in the snow. She had been watching the station activity with the absolute attention children bring to situations they don't fully understand. She was watching Cross now. Cross stopped. The girl tilted her head. "You're the one who was outside," she said. "In the snow, really early." Cross looked at her. "My dad saw you when he got up to check the equipment. He said you were really still, like a statue." The station had quieted around them, the loading activity continuing but the voices dropping, people finding reasons to be approximately facing this direction. "He said you were watching something really far away," the girl said. "Can you see far?" Cross crouched down to the child's level. She studied her face for a moment, the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of it, the absence of judgment that children under 10 still sometimes have. She held up one finger, then pointed at her own eye. The girl considered this interpretation, one eye, seeing far. "Can you show me?" she asked. Cross stood. She looked out at the snowfield, at the middle distance, at some specific point that only she had the calibration to find. Then she crouched back down and put her hand gently over the girl's eyes, repositioning her so they were both facing the same direction. She pointed. "I don't see anything," the girl said. Cross pointed again, adjusting the angle slightly. "Oh," the girl said. "Is that a bird?" It was probably not a bird. It was probably a piece of ice catching the light in a way that approximated wings. But Cross made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a laugh. Just a sound, the second sound she had made in the presence of other people in 3 days. The girl looked up at her. "You can talk," she said. It was not accusatory, just observational. Cross looked at the snowfield, at the middle distance, at the specific calibrations of the world she had been the only one, for a long time, able to see. Then she looked at the girl. "Yes," she said. Her voice was low, a little rough from disuse, but steady. The girl seemed to find this perfectly reasonable. "My name's Clara," she said. Cross looked at her. Something in her face had changed again, that slow rearrangement, but fuller now, something having found a position it could hold. "Vanessa," she said. Marsh, standing in the doorway, did not say anything. He turned back inside before anyone could see his face. Fisk was beside him. "She'll be all right," Fisk said. "I know," Marsh said. "You don't know." "No," he agreed. "But she showed up anyway. The ones who keep showing up are usually all right, eventually." Fisk looked at the door for a moment. "She's going to disappear again," she said. "Isn't she?" "Probably. And we won't know where." They went back to work. Outside, Vanessa Cross and the girl named Clara stood in the pale winter light, looking at whatever was out there, the thing that was maybe a bird and maybe wasn't, the snowfield and the rocks and the long white distance. And for a few minutes, neither of them spoke. And the silence between them was not the old kind, not the kind that was punishment or armor, or the wall you build when you've decided you don't deserve to take up space. It was just quiet, the ordinary quiet of two people looking at the same thing. When the convoy prepared to leave, Cross went to the lead vehicle and spoke briefly with the driver. She accepted a supply pack and a canteen. She checked the sky the particular way she always checked it, not looking for weather exactly, but reading it, noting the pressure of it, the angle of the light, the information it carried about what the hours ahead would hold. She laced the pack straps without looking at them. Her hands knew how. Marsh watched her from the door. She didn't look back at the station. She looked north, at the ridge line, at the clean white line where the mountain met the sky. She put the pack on. She began to walk, not away from something, or not only that, toward whatever came next, which was unknown, which was cold, which was hers. The snow received her footprints and held them for a while. Then the wind came back, and the world was white and clean and the same as it had been before she arrived, which was the way of cold places. They did not retain the shape of the people who moved through them. But the station would remember. Price would remember, lying on his stretcher, looking at the ceiling and turning the name over, Vanessa Cross, not dead, not done. Fisk would remember, the trajectory calculations logged in the station manifest in handwriting she recognized as not her own. Harlow, who had laughed at a woman mopping a floor, would remember the moment he'd understood that the floor was the least of what she was doing. Even Sims, who was young and would probably forget the specifics, would remember the shape of something, the feeling of standing in a room where you had been wrong about what mattered and having to recalibrate. And Marsh would remember the sound of her voice. Low, rough, steady. Vanessa. One word,